What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video. This time we're going to be doing the Magicka Warden DPS in the Clockwork City patch. Just like the rest of our build videos, we're going to be going over gear, skill points, what skills we have on which bars, as well as our CP distribution, and then a brief discussion about our Parse. We're going to do a 3 million dummy Parse, then we're going to take a look at our combat metrics and talk about some of the nuances and intricacies behind the Magicka Warden DPS. We're going to start things off here with gear. Our monster helm for a Magicka Warden is going to be a Valken Scoria. This is because we're going to be using the Cliff Diver race, the Cliff Racer instead of Crushing Shock as our spammable. If you're going to be using Crushing Shock, you might want to use Lambris instead. However, Scoria's is probably pulls about the equal amounts of DPS. You get a little bit of extra health, so you can put all Magicka enchants on. If you do decide to go with Lambris in a Force Pulse build, that's going to be a little bit different in terms of gear. You'll be using an Asylum Staff instead of a Master Architect or Moondancer Inferno Staff, so that'll be in a separate video, I think. So Scorias, we're going to be using Necropotence. This is going to be a pet build. We are using the bear. The good thing about Magicka Wardens is that you can continue to use Necropotence even without the bear up, because Blue Betties do count as a pet in terms of Necropotence 5-piece effect. For our jewelry, we're using Master Architect. All of them have spell damage enchants. Magicka Wardens do have better sustain compared to other Magicka DPS classes. The only Magicka DPS that beats them out in terms of sustain is probably going to be the Magicka Nightblade due to their leeching strikes. The Blue Betty that the Wardens have access to really does help out their sustain quite a bit, so their sustain problems aren't nearly as bad as some other Magicka DPS classes. For our staff, it's going to be Master Architect Inferno Staff infused with a shock damage enchant. So you can use, instead of Master Architect, you can use Moondancer or Infallible Aether. Infallible Aether will pull a little bit less than the other two, but it's going to be basically a matter of which Inferno Staff do you get first, which set do you get first. So if you happen to get a Master Architect Inferno Staff first, then you're going to go with Master Architect, and so on and so forth with Moondancer and IA. The DPS difference between all three sets is pretty minimal. It should be identical between Moondancer and Master Architect. And our back bar, we're using a Nirnhone Maelstrom Lightning Staff with a weapon damage enchant. You can go with Sharpened or Infused with weapon damage enchant. With Infused, you get a little bit more single target DPS at the expense of some AoE DPS. Nirnhone is still very strong in Clockwork City, so I prefer using Nirnhone over Infused, because you will have to heavy attack in trials scenarios and boss fights, so Nirnhone will give you a little bit more oomph behind your spells when paired with the weapon damage enchant compared to just straight up infused. For our attributes, we're going all points into Magicka. With Scoria, we have about 16.7k health, so if you want to hit 17k health, you just need to put us a few points into health. 3 points into health will easily get you up to the 17k threshold, that gold standard for vet content, but that all depends on how comfortable you feel with the class and how comfortable you feel with the mechanics. For example, I personally run a bit lower health on some of my Magicka DPS because you do have access to shields, so you do have a little bit more survivability there. For our Mundus, we're going to be going with the Apprentice. You can go with Lover if you need the penetration. Remember, the penetration cap is 18,200. That's the magic number you're looking for. So kind of look at what debuffs you're going to get. The only sets that will debuff the enemy for Magicka DPS is going to be Alkosh. So look and ask around, see what your group is running, and you can make the adjustments accordingly, whether you need to use Apprentice or the Lover. Personally, I would recommend sticking with the Apprentice and instead using your CP points to get your penetration up to 18,000. For our skill bars here, our front bar, this is where we would normally put our shields, either Harness Magicka or Dampen Magic. However, we are going with Elemental Drain instead because we are going to be doing a Parse at the end of this video. Screaming Cliff Racers, this is going to be your spammable. Winter's Revenge. I have Crushing Shock here. This is not going to be used for your spammable. This is really just there to maintain your Ancient Knowledge passive, as well as provide a ranged interrupt if you need it, depending on the fight. So this isn't going to be your main spammable for this build. Inner Light, and then we have Guardian's Wrath. For our back bar, we have Lotus Blossom. This helps out a little bit with your health sustain, since you will be light weaving and getting health back. Blockade of Storms, Fletcher Infection, Blue Betty, Inner Light again, and you have the double slot Guardian's Wrath. For our CP points, with Clockwork City you get 230 points in each of the 3 colors. 75 in Tenacity, 75 in Arcanist, those are the key ones you want to hit. The other 80 points can be split among these next 3 nodes. I have 26 in Warlord, 26 in Tumbling, and 28 in Shadow Ward. Now for the mage CPs, we're going to talk about Spell Erosion for a little bit here. Again, you want to hit the penetration cap of 18,200. So this particular CP configuration is optimized for the raid group that I run in as a DPS. We have access to Infused Torog's Crusher as well as Stamplar for Power of Delight. So this particular configuration maximizes my penetration without over-penetrating for my specific group. So if you have a tank running Alkosh as long with an Infused Torog's Crusher, you might not need to put as many points into a Spell Erosion, so you can take points out of Spell Erosion and put them into other nodes to increase your DPS. So that's all based on whatever debuffs you have, and it's very specific to your group, so do the math and figure out how many points you need to put into Spell Erosion. 34 into Elfborn, 49 into Elemental Expert, 34 into Master at Arms, and 75 into Thaumaturge. Always going to want to keep 75 points in Thaumaturge for that Exploiter passive. If you have to put points out of these nodes and to put them into Spell Erosion, take out of Elfborn first, and then Master at Arms, and then Elemental Expert, trying to avoid going too low in Elfborn or Master at Arms. Because Magicka DPS are running lower crit chance bonuses compared to previous patches, you have a lesser impact on your DPS if you take points out of Elfborn compared to the other 2 nodes. Now for our red CPs, this particular configuration is a one-size-fits-most scenario. You can redistribute these points accordingly depending on the content you're running. For example, if you're going to be running Mauve Lorcage, there's more magic damage coming in compared to physical damage, so you're going to want to put more points into your magic resistance nodes instead of your physical resistance nodes. So we have 44 in Ironclad, 40 in Thickskin, 56 in Hardy, 56 in Elemental Defender, and 34 into Bastion. Some other important things to take note of: we will be using Witch Mother's Potent Brew to help out with the sustain a little bit. We do take a hit in health, but that extra regen really helps out a lot. You can use blue food, max health, max magicka. The difference in DPS there is going to be pretty small. Blue food will win out, but that extra sustain from Witch Mothers is just very nice to have. And then we're going to be using Essence of Spell Power, Major Sorcery, Major Prophecy, and Major Intellect. If you have Alchemy all the way up to level 50, make sure to get your Medicinal Use passive out of 3 out of 3, so that way you can maintain those 3 buffs the entire time you're fighting a boss, because as long as you're using your potions on cooldown. So we're going to go ahead and do our parse here. Remember, this is a 3 million dummy parse. Self-buffed, so we're not getting any buffs like Combat Prayer, we're not getting Alkosh, Crusher, or anything like that on our dummies, so do keep that in mind when we get our final parse number. In addition, this is a 3 million dummy parse in an actual trial scenario, an actual endgame content. You'll be in fights for much longer, anywhere from 4 to 5 minutes all the way up to half an hour for the final boss of the newest trial. So do keep that in mind, so whatever sustained problems you might see in this parse will only be made worse due to a longer fight. So do keep that in mind when we do our parse. So we're going to go ahead and get started now in 3, 2, and 1. So there we go, a 32.2k DPS Parse from a Magicka Warden. This is a pet build, so do keep that in mind. You won't be able to use this build for every single fight. There are going to be some fights where you won't be able to use your bear, for example, the mage in Ethereum Archive or the warrior in Hel Ra. So check in with your raid lead, and you do want to make sure you have a non-pet build. I do have a non-pet build for a Magicka Warden that's going to be in a separate video, so you can check that out if you don't have any ideas for a non-pet build. So quickly going over our comment metrics. Parse, your Cliff Racer does a lot of damage. Look at that, it's 21.4%, so it's very powerful. This is why we want to use Cliff Racer instead of Force Pulse as our spammable. And you can see there the pet is just does a lot of DPS, really powerful. Pet builds in general are very strong, and while this build does not pull as much DPS as say a Magicka Sork or a Magicka Nightblade, it's still very respectable. At 32.2k self-buffed, Parse is not that bad, so do keep that in mind. So if you take a look at our regen versus drain per second, we have about 300 Magicka difference. We didn't see any sustain issues, and part of that is due to the fact that we have such large Magicka pools thanks to Necropotence. But like I said in the start of the parse, this is only 3 million damage. In an actual raid scenario, we're going to see a lot this disparity come into play. You're going to have a lot more sustain problems due to this disparity between regen per second and drain per second. So that's it for this video. Hope this guide helps, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.